Okay, as we're in the #1 digital country in the world, we thought we'd use a bit of digital technology to help Dr. Shin keep us in line. So I'm going to have 5 minutes and Rachel's going to have 15. So I will actually start it now. So when it pings, that means Jackie, shut up. Okay, I think you've got the most modern slides. The presentation is about a new book that we're preparing that comes out of a European-funded project. And the central concept we're looking at in the book is the concept of ecosystems. And the theoretical framework we're addressing is essentially varieties of capitalism debate. And we want to look at varieties of digitalization, because the short version is, when we look, as Rachel will point out, the empirical evidence on trends in digitalization, it doesn't really correspond to the established frameworks, either in comparative welfare states or in comparative forms of capitalism, i.e., Germany doesn't do as well as they like to think they did in the past. And countries that you think should be doing badly, like Spain, Ireland, these kind of countries in Europe are doing very, very well. So the question is, why is that happening? These were countries hit by the financial crisis. They shouldn't be doing that well. So what we want to say is that digitalization is also disrupting our theoretical frameworks. And what we want to do with the ecosystem idea is try and draw on that literature of comparative business, political economy, to try and say, how do we explain some of these changes we're observing? Okay, so we've got the clicker. Have to work out how to use that. Well done. Briefly, I'm going to talk about the concept, and Rachel's going to look at the various evidence we have and draw on some things we got from Korea. Very briefly at the end, a comparison of the UK and Korea I think would be interesting. And why do we do these comparisons and what can we learn from them? Right. Okay, the concept of digital welfare ecosystems. When we came up with this idea about 2 years ago, and I was explaining it to some of my colleagues, they said, well, what's that different from what we already know about institutionalism? And then I explained to them about what I've just said. And then they said, oh, okay, maybe it's a good idea to try and pursue. So where did this idea come from and why does it matter? This is a really very, very simplified version of the concept. So if we start, I don't even know if I'll get that bit. If we start here, what's really significantly different is that we have to take account of the producers of these digital technologies. So these are domain specialist developers, investors, technical support people who are developing a kind of semantic core that digital systems can speak to each other. And these are really essential in government as you speak across different departments and how these systems speak to users and how users can interact with the interface. This is really, really core. And this is why some countries like Estonia have been very successful, but countries are adopting very different models. Part of this eco-structure is those people are at the core of it. Around them are public authorities who buy these systems or try and produce their own, or license them, i.e. the state, often, because the state is also responsible for financing where the cables are laid. And then it's also the citizens and users. So it's understanding the interaction between these three different spheres that we're interested in. And why this disrupts the previous frameworks is that these digital components were never part of the original varieties of capitalism approach, because we didn't need them. So we talked about business models like Kaizen in Japan, or Kaibol, have I pronounced it right? In Korea, the whole Kaibol system of business organisation around family firms, even companies like Samsung or LG, these are classic types of Korean firms, employ a lot of people. But it's also thinking about how the digital affects them and how startups like Nava, for example, fit into that ecosystem today. And even my translation device, if I worked out how to press the right button. So the three components we want to look at in the framework looks at the state as it develops new infrastructure, who it licenses it to, what it pays for. We want to look at businesses that provide the technological services and infrastructure and the businesses that use it, including organisations like the state. How are they having to talk to business in a way that they're not used to? And when we talk to civil servants in the UK, they say we don't actually know how to talk to business very well. They'll admit that. And the third really important group are communities who are using these technologies. If anybody wants a good film and can pretend that that's part of their work routine, I recommend Ken Loach, I, Daniel Blake, is a great film to show how certain people in the labour market are excluded from accessing benefits. And that really sums up the problem of what we're trying to get at. Okay. The framework involves the state, business and community, and these all operate at very different levels. So in our context of Europe, even though we're Brexited, the European Union, we have a look at national, regional and local levels, because what our research has found, it also matters how local authorities, some of them are really at the forefront and going to the Treasury and saying, we've got a great idea, finance it, and the Treasury says yes sometimes, and other people are scratching themselves not knowing what to do. Right, I'm going to move to Rachel, who will now look at the results from the book we're preparing, and I'll sum up at the end. I think you press that bit.
All right, so to give a bit of colour and evidence to what Jackie was talking about, I'm going to run through some of the data that we use to really show these varieties of digitalisation. And there's a lot of it. Now we have this kind of rich availability of comparable data. There are plenty of different surveys to draw upon, but the ones that we've used in this project, and this really, as Jackie mentioned, began with the Euroship project, so that was 7 different European countries looking at basically how kind of government has transitioned and the digitalisation of work and welfare. So primarily we drew upon the Digital Economy and Society Index, which as of the end of last year is now known as the State of the Digital Decade. And then some of the associated indexes that kind of speak to and feed into that. So that's the e-government benchmark and the international DESI. And then today I wanted to give a bit more of a kind of broader flavour as well and introduce some of the data from Korea. So we've also looked at the UN e-government development index and the Digital Intelligence Index. So why is this important? Well, you can see there the quote on the left-hand side, now more than ever, understanding the digital ecosystem has become an urgent and relevant policy exercise. Digital transformation is very much at the core of policy commitments of governments globally. So, for instance, in Europe, as kind of in the aftermath of COVID, they established the Recovery and Resilience Facility, whereby 130 billion was earmarked to this kind of digital transformation of government. So in light of these policy commitments, why are these benchmarks important? And we've kind of identified 3 different goals. So they function as a proxy measurement, so it's an ability to kind of monitor progress over time. They also function to kind of leverage policy and identify where it's working and it's not working, and to raise consciousness. And there's kind of a broad, in terms of the measures that we've looked at, while the dimensions and the different indicators that they use do vary, there's kind of a broad focus on the topics that they look at, those being around the transformation of government, those being around leadership and skills, but also infrastructure, so kind of connectivity and those kinds of issues. So this is, I'm just going to kind of give a bit of an overview of some of these benchmarks and indexes, and this is drawn from the DESI. It's the 2022 ranking because, as I say, it switched over to the State of the Digital Decade last year, so you don't get these nice composite indexes, which I think are quite useful for just highlighting some of the stuff that Jackie kind of alluded to. So you can see there kind of at the middle, near the EU average level, you've got Germany. At the lower end of the scale, you have Italy, and also part of the Euroship project, we have Hungary further down on the right-hand side there. And then thinking about the survey team, you have Denmark here, one of the top performing countries, doing really well. And the DESI draws, it's been established since 2014. It's an annual measure of progress, so it provides a really useful way to kind of monitor and see how this has developed over time. You can also then go down and kind of drill into those different dimensions to really see what they look like. And I think this is focusing on the public services dimension and one element of that, so the level of e-government users. And I think this is interesting because it shows that the countries perhaps aren't performing as you might expect. So you might think that that there's just going to be a kind of broad kind of upward convergence, but actually it's more variable than that. You can see actually there's a huge uptick for Italy at the bottom there. Denmark and Estonia are performing really well at the top, but the likes of Germany, the level of e-government users actually declined during COVID. These are quite shocking findings. Then also kind of casting the net a little bit wider, the international DESI, and this is again focusing on the public services dimension, looks at not only EU member states but draws on a wider basis, so it includes 18 non-EU countries as well for kind of a broader sort of peer group of comparison. And you can see there obviously Korea is top, and it consistently performs really well. In terms of who the EU top 4 are, that relates to, for this dimension, Denmark, France, the Netherlands and Estonia. So you can start to see, even though we're looking at some different kind of benchmarks and indexes and the data is very different, actually who's performing well and who's not performing so well, there are actually quite a lot of similarities as you start to run through some of this. So we started to kind of, having looked at some of this data, draw some broad findings, I suppose. So you can see some dimensions, despite investment and despite kind of governments prioritising development, they're not progressing at the same speed. So for instance, it seems to be harder to have a kind of impact in terms of digital skills, despite the fact that governments are obviously trying to tackle it. And you can also see that the largest EU economies are not the front runners, and I think that's quite a nice point at which to start then thinking about some of the broader kind of global measures. And this is drawn from the UN e-Government Development Index. And again, the kind of measures are quite similar. So they look at telecommunications infrastructure, they look at human capital and skills, and the online service index. And you can see there that clearly country income level matters, yeah? So the darker blue countries are those that are more advanced. But interestingly, when you start to unpick some of that within the index, you can see, for instance, that Italy came out at 37th, Hungary was down at 51st place. So, once you start unpicking, you can see the nuance behind these kind of broader measures. And what's also interesting when you start to kind of analyse some of this data is how these surveys change year on year. So, for instance, in terms of the UN survey, in more recent years, they're including a most popular city analysis. So you can start to see, even when countries are top performing, what does that then look like within those countries? So not just examining the between country differences, but the within country differences. And also how the kind of the things that they're interested in have changed. So, for instance, in more recent years for the UN index, things like digital inclusion seem to be getting kind of increasing levels of mention. So in terms of that 2022 index, the top 10 performers there you can see. You can also start to identify trends in how governments are prioritising their transition. So, as you might expect, during COVID, there was a clear boost for countries making social protection, welfare and benefit systems available online. There was a boost of 17% in that 2-year period. But also, and this kind of perhaps speaks as well to some of the kind of big social challenges we're talking about in the survey, that these emerging policy areas are really starting to develop. So things like AI and how to align the digital transformation with the green transition, and as I mentioned earlier, digital inclusion. Another survey and benchmark that we looked at was the Digital Intelligence Index, and this includes 90 different global countries. And I've highlighted some of the findings there from some of the indicators for some of the countries on the survey team. And again, a new development for the Digital Intelligence Index was the digital trust measure. And this, I think, is really interesting. So, when you're, starting to think about how countries are progressing in terms of their infrastructure and skills, actually, what does it mean then in terms of how people feel and how citizens feel when they're interacting with it? And again, I think this starts to speak to some of the public anxieties that we're starting to look at in the survey. So it might be quite interesting to kind of compare the findings across the two. So, for instance, in terms of the attitudes, what that relates to is how the public perceive the trust in tech companies, how they feel about their job prospects or social trust. In terms of behaviour, it relates to their level of digital media consumption, their use of e-commerce, their use of social media and tech. And these things are starting to kind of come out as quite key themes as you start to measure how these benchmarks and indexes are changing over time. So what does this all mean? I think the scoring on its own perhaps isn't so meaningful, but what it really does do is it starts to bring those kind of different experiences into light. And then relating back to those 3 goals that I mentioned at the start, what can we start to observe when we start comparing these big data sets, and what that kind of looks like for countries? You can see, firstly, there is an upward convergence. Countries do tend to be getting better, but that pace is very much varied. So, for instance, the likes of China or the Netherlands have seen a very rapid improvement, whereas the likes of, say, the UK and Norway have seen that their progress is faltering. You can also start to identify that while they're looking at different kind of things and the metrics and the indicators are different, actually the findings are quite similar in terms of who's doing well and who's not doing so well. That there's very much phases of development, so it's a process. You can't run before you can walk, so countries tend to focus on services for national users first, before they're looking at kind of cross-border services. They tend to focus more on services for businesses rather than services for citizens, and they tend to put their basic services online first before then thinking and developing around things like key enablers. In terms of how it functions as a policy lever, you can see when you start to look at some of those countries that are the top performers, what do they do? Well, they very much have targeted strategy, and that targeted strategy is then monitored over time. You implement it, you monitor it, and then you adapt it and make sure that it's fit for purpose. And the graphic from the right-hand side there is these top-performing countries don't tend to just buy off the shelf packages, but they will develop them, so they'll run an alpha test and then a beta test prior to implementation. You can also start to identify kind of similarity in some of the policies that countries are using in terms of their digital transformation. So one of the main ones is this kind of use of open and interoperable data, so sharing data between public and private sector bodies. Having a fully functioning digital identity system is really important, but also having streamlined services. So the graphic on the right-hand side there, this is one of the goals of the EU Digital Compass, this idea that you should only put your data in once, and that enables the services between national or local government to be much more streamlined. So, what does that mean? Well, through kind of looking at these different benchmarks, we've been able to identify some of the sort of social and economic conditions that have been related to the top performers across the different indexes. And those are this kind of high level of coordination between each of the actors, for instance, the data sharing being a key example of that. That there does tend to be a strong level of trust in government and, between citizens willing to kind of trust the kind of tech firms in terms of using their data. That the historical juncture for countries does tend to be particularly important, certainly, for the likes of Korea, and also as part of the European project, the likes of Estonia, who do really, really well as well. And that there has to be a strong political will, and that there can't be a kind of a divide in that. That obviously the country income level is important, and that ongoing investment is needed, and that the level of technical skill is also relevant in terms of those barometers and what they look like. So then relating it back to these kind of varieties of digitalisation that Jackie talked about, what do we mean? So I just wanted to kind of give an example, really. So we categorise the UK as fragmented in terms of their position. While they introduced the government digital service in 2011, and it was much applauded and copied by various countries around the world, and they were topping some of these indexes sort of around the 2015, 2016 mark, their progress has faltered, and it's slowed, and it started to drop. And then when you start to kind of try and unpick why that might be, particularly when you're comparing that to who's doing well, some of the evidence we've found, suggests and speaks to this fragmented version of digitalisation. So, for instance, there's a great deal of technical debt. And what I mean by that is, for instance, our National Police database was created in 1974, and it hasn't been updated since then. This is a database that is used on a daily basis by police, the police up and down the country. It's the main database for accessing criminal records. For instance, the pension services computer system was established in 1988 and again hasn't been updated. What does that mean? Well, you know, it's costly to run these things. That's why they call it technical debt, because they are so outdated. Just maintaining them costs a hell of a lot. But also you're getting really poor quality data out of them. So, you know, you're missing out on this kind of wealth of opportunity and development simply because you haven't updated and upgraded these systems. They've struggled to implement a digital identity system that has buy-in from all, you know, across the different government departments, which again has kind of hampered development. We very much have a siloed approach. So, you know, individual government departments have not really spoken to each other in terms of how they're kind of implementing this change and sort of the sharing of best practice. You know, it seems to be that departments seem to kind of make it up for their own department and not share as well as they might. And I think part of the issue there is the kind of the lack of digital professionals that we have. So you've got a 4% average across the public sector compared to about a 10% when you look across industry. So how does that compare to Korea? Obviously, I'm learning a lot today, but, you know, what are you doing and what are you doing well? Well, you clearly have, you know, a very early adoption of some of these key themes. In terms of the digital platform government in 2023, this public-private, interministerial and central local government collaboration has been really important, that there's been a kind of ongoing drive for innovation. But I'd really like to, you know, hopefully we'll have some opportunities later on to kind of listen and learn and find out, how the question of trust has been approached, but also around kind of digital inclusion and the strategy that's implemented there.
Great. And we're still to time. We've got about 1 minute left. So just in conclusion, we are suggesting that this Varieties of digitalization approach can offer us something, a more organic and dynamic analysis of how these societies and institutions are being built, because it is a work in progress everywhere. And it allows us to ask some new questions about who are the key actors and how they're working together or not, and why. So it will build on what we know of varieties of capitalism, but it's also building in new ways, and that's a kind of creative, interesting way to look at it. And that's one, I think there's one more left, right? Okay, and this is how did these systems evolve, these digital systems evolve in relationship to the non-digital world around them? So how do communities actually interact or not with these systems? And as Professor Lee asked how we might do future collaborations, on the 16th and 17th of December, we're having a workshop at Sussex, and you would be very welcome to join us to talk about digital ecosystems. So we would very much welcome papers from any of you who'd like to come and tell us what's happening in Korea. The workshop is largely going to be looking at contributions from the Euroship project about the European projects, but we really want to get some contributions from Korea and from some other non-European countries to that. So maybe we'll see you in Sussex at Christmas. Thank you. And we still kept to time.